The Idaho 1996 cold case that shattered a community was finally solved after 25 years of silence. On June 13th, 18-year-old Angie Ray Dodge was found raped and murdered in her Idaho Falls apartment, her bright future stolen in an instant. Within months, police arrested Christopher Tapp, a nervous teenager from Angie's circle. Despite no DNA evidence linking him to the crime, he confessed under relentless interrogation. The community breathed easier, believing justice was served. But Angie's mother, Carol, never stopped doubting. For over 2 decades, she fought to uncover the truth while Tapp rotted in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Then in 2019, genetic genealogy revealed the shocking truth. The real killer had been hiding in plain sight, living just across the street from Angie the night she died. When Brian Leigh Dripps Sr. finally confessed, it exposed a devastating question that haunts Idaho Falls. To this day, how many other innocent people are paying for crimes they never committed? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The summer morning of June 13, 1996, started like any other in Idaho Falls. Birds chirped outside apartment windows. Coffee makers gurgled to life. Newspaper delivery trucks rumbled down quiet streets, lined with modest homes and aging apartment complexes. But at 1565 I Street, something was terribly wrong. Angie Ray, Dodge's friend, knocked on the apartment door. No answer. She tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, sunlight streamed through thin curtains, illuminating a scene of unthinkable horror. Angie lay motionless on her bedroom floor. Blood pooled beneath her 18-year-old body. Her bright eyes, once full of curiosity and laughter, stared at nothing. The friend screamed and stumbled backward, her shaking hands fumbling for the phone. Within minutes, police sirens wailed through the peaceful neighborhood. Officers rushed inside, their faces hardening as they processed the brutality. Detective work began immediately. Yellow tape stretched across doorways. Cameras flashed. Evidence bags crinkled as investigators collected every trace that might lead to justice. The attack had been savage. Angie had been raped and stabbed multiple times. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Whoever did this had somehow gained her trust, or she had known her killer. News traveled fast in a town of 50,000. By noon, reporters gathered outside the crime scene. By evening, every household in Idaho Falls knew that evil had visited their quiet community. Carol Dodge arrived at the scene in a panic, having heard fragments of terrible news from neighbors. When officers confirmed her worst fears, she collapsed against the yellow tape, her world shattering in an instant. Her bright, independent daughter, the girl who loved art and dreamed of college, was gone forever. The crime scene photos would become crucial evidence, capturing not just the horror of the attack, but details that would matter decades later. Blood spatter patterns, the position of furniture, tiny fibers and traces of DNA that 1996 technology could barely process. As darkness fell over Idaho Falls, mothers locked their doors tighter. Fathers checked windows twice. The sense of safety that small towns cherish had vanished with Angie's life. The Idaho Falls Police Department buzzed with urgent activity. Detective desks overflowed with witness statements, evidence logs, and crime scene photographs. The Angie Dodge murder had become the department's top priority. Detective interviews began immediately. Who had seen Angie recently? Did she have any enemies? Was she dating anyone? The questions came rapid fire, desperate to find leads before the killer could strike again. The DNA evidence collected from the scene offered hope. Biological samples found on Angie's body could potentially identify her attacker. But in 1996, DNA technology was still evolving. The samples were sent to state labs with instructions to run them through every database possible. Days turned into weeks. The DNA came back with devastating news. No match in any criminal database. The killer's genetic signature existed, preserved in evidence bags, but belonged to a ghost. Public tension reached a breaking point. Local news broadcasts opened each night with updates on the investigation. Still no arrests in the Angie Dodge murder, anchors would report, their voices heavy with community frustration. Women changed their routines. They avoided walking alone after dark. They installed extra locks and peepholes. Some bought their first guns. The fear was tangible, creeping through grocery store aisles and church pews. Carol Dodge gave her first interview 2 weeks after finding her daughter's killer remained free. Her eyes, red from countless tears, looked directly into the camera. "Someone in this community knows who did this," she said, her voice steady despite her grief. "Angie was loved by everyone who knew her. She didn't deserve this. Please, if you know anything, call the police." The phone lines lit up with tips, suspicious neighbors, ex-boyfriends, strangers seen near the apartment complex. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, but none led to an arrest. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology and luck to reveal its secrets. The killer walked free among the very people searching for him, hidden in plain sight. Pressure mounted on Idaho Falls police as summer turned to fall. The mayor fielded angry calls from residents demanding answers. The police chief held weekly briefings with increasingly frustrated reporters. The Angie Dodge case was becoming a symbol of the department's limitations. Investigators decided to focus on young men in Angie's social circle. If the killer had gained entry without force, perhaps she knew him. They compiled lists of friends, acquaintances, and anyone who had crossed paths with the bright 18-year-old. Christopher Tapp's name appeared on several lists. He was 19, nervous around authority, and had attended parties where Angie was present. He lived with his mother and had no criminal record, but detectives decided he warranted closer attention. The first interview was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October. Tapp arrived at the police station wearing jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, his hands trembling slightly as he signed in at the front desk. "We just need to ask you a few questions about Angie," Detective Reynolds explained, leading him to a small interrogation room. "Nothing formal, just trying to understand who she was spending time with." The room was sterile and intimidating. A metal table occupied the center, surrounded by uncomfortable chairs. A video camera mounted in the corner captured everything, its red recording light blinking steadily. Tapp shifted in his seat, glancing repeatedly at the camera. "I didn't really know her that well," he said. "I mean, we hung out at the same parties sometimes, but we weren't close friends or anything. But you knew where she lived." Detective Martinez pressed. "Yeah, I think so. That apartment complex on I Street, right?" The detectives exchanged glances. They had their first person of interest. Over the next several weeks, they would call Tapp back repeatedly, each interview growing more intense, more focused on finding inconsistencies in his story. What started as routine questioning was about to become something far more sinister. Christopher Tapp returned to the police station 6 times over the following months. Each visit lasted longer than the last. The questions became more aggressive, the pressure more intense. Detective recordings from these sessions would later reveal the troubling techniques used: sleep deprivation tactics, threats about the death penalty, suggestions that cooperation would lead to leniency. Hour after hour, day after day, they chipped away at the anxious teenager's resistance. "We know you were involved, Chris," Detective Reynolds would say, leaning across the small table. "Your story keeps changing. Innocent people don't change their stories." Tapp would shake his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know anything about what happened to Angie. I swear I don't." But the interrogations continued. Detectives claimed they had witnesses placing him at the scene. They said his DNA would eventually be found. They told him that cooperating now was his only chance to avoid the electric chair. The psychological pressure was overwhelming for a young man already struggling with anxiety and low self-esteem. Sleep became impossible. Food tasted like cardboard. Every ring of the telephone sent panic through his chest. In the interrogation room, a clock ticked loudly on the wall. Its constant rhythm marked the hours of relentless questioning. Tick, tick, tick. The sound would haunt Tapp's memories for decades. "Just tell us what happened," Detective Martinez would say, her voice softer but no less insistent. "We can help you if you tell us the truth, but we can't help you if you keep lying." Eventually, exhausted and terrified, Tapp began to give them fragments of what they wanted to hear. Maybe he had been near the apartment that night. Maybe he had seen something. Maybe he knew more than he initially remembered. Each small admission led to larger ones. The detectives guided his story, suggesting details, correcting inconsistencies, shaping a narrative that would fit their theory of the crime. "I just want to go home," Tapp whispered during one session, his head buried in his hands, but home seemed increasingly far away. By spring 1997, prosecutors felt confident enough to file charges. Despite the complete absence of physical evidence linking Christopher Tapp to Angie's murder, his inconsistent statements and eventual partial admissions provided the foundation for their case. The charging documents painted a picture of a troubled young man who had sexually assaulted and murdered an innocent girl. The DNA evidence that failed to match Tapp was explained away as contamination or degradation over time. Carol Dodge received the call on a Tuesday morning. "Mrs. Dodge, this is District Attorney Henderson. I wanted you to hear this from me personally. We're filing charges against Christopher Tapp for your daughter's murder." Carol's reaction was complex. Relief that someone would finally be held accountable, mixed with nagging doubt. She had met Tapp briefly at social gatherings. He seemed gentle, almost shy. Could this nervous teenager really have committed such a brutal crime? "Are you certain it's him?" she asked. "We have his confession, Mrs. Dodge. Multiple statements placing him at the scene. The jury will hear everything." But privately, Carol's doubts lingered. The DNA evidence troubled her. If technology could identify a killer from biological traces, why hadn't it identified Tapp? She voiced these concerns to investigators, who assured her that forensic science wasn't perfect. The community's response was mixed. Many residents felt relieved that an arrest had finally been made. Parents could sleep easier knowing the killer was behind bars, but others quietly wondered whether police had rushed to judgment. At the grocery store, at church, in coffee shops, throughout Idaho Falls, people whispered about the case. Some defended Tapp, describing him as a scapegoat. Others pointed to his confession as proof of guilt. Local newspapers ran front-page stories about the charges. "Dodge murder suspect arrested," screamed the headlines. Photos of Tapp being led into the courthouse in handcuffs dominated the evening news. For Christopher Tapp, the nightmare was just beginning. The trial of Christopher Tapp began in February 1998, nearly 2 years after Angie Dodge's murder. The courthouse overflowed with reporters, curious residents, and family members from both sides. Carol Dodge sat in the front row every day, clutching a small photo of Angie. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Tapp's recorded statements. Hour after hour, the jury listened to interrogation tapes. They heard his voice, shaking and uncertain, describing details of the crime. The recordings were compelling, even though they contained numerous inconsistencies. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Henderson began his opening statement. "You will hear the defendant's own words, his own admission of guilt, his own description of how he brutally attacked Angie Dodge." The defense faced an uphill battle. Public opinion had already convicted Tapp in the court of community sentiment. His appointed attorney argued that the confession was coerced, obtained through psychological manipulation and threats, but the recordings spoke for themselves. Witness testimony filled days of proceedings. Friends described Angie as vibrant and trusting. Investigators explained their methodical search for evidence. Medical examiners detailed the horrific nature of her injuries. Throughout the trial, one fact remained undisputed. None of the physical evidence matched Christopher Tapp. Not the DNA, not the fingerprints, not a single trace of his presence at the crime scene. But the jury seemed most moved by the confession tapes. His voice, admitting involvement, carried more weight than any scientific evidence. In 1998, DNA technology was still relatively new and unfamiliar to most people. A confession, however, was something everyone could understand. The trial transcripts would later reveal the weakness of the case against Tapp. But in the moment, surrounded by community pressure for justice, the jury found his own words convincing. After 3 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the silence was deafening. 12 citizens of Idaho Falls had reached their verdict. "Has the jury reached a decision?" Judge Harrison asked. The foreman, a middle-aged man with weathered hands, stood slowly. "We have, Your Honor, in the matter of the state of Idaho versus Christopher Tapp, on the charge of murder in the first degree. How do you find? Guilty." The single word echoed through the packed courtroom. Carol Dodge closed her eyes and exhaled deeply. Behind her, Tapp's mother began to sob. Christopher himself seemed to fold inward, his shoulders shaking silently. Additional guilty verdicts followed for rape and for using a deadly weapon. Each pronouncement felt like another nail in the coffin of Tapp's future. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following month. As court officers led Tapp away in shackles, his eyes swept across the gallery. He looked directly at Carol Dodge, his expression one of desperate sadness rather than guilt. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Henderson held a press conference. "Justice has been served for Angie Dodge and her family," he declared. "This conviction shows that our community will not tolerate such heinous crimes." But some observers noted what wasn't mentioned: the complete lack of physical evidence connecting Tapp to the crime, the DNA that didn't match, the fingerprints that led nowhere, the confession obtained through methods that would later be questioned by experts. Carol Dodge spoke briefly to reporters. "I'm grateful that someone will be held accountable," she said. But her voice lacked the satisfaction that typically comes with justice. Deep in her heart, questions remained. That night, Idaho Falls slept more peacefully. The monster had been caught and caged, or so they believed. Sentencing day arrived with March snow dusting the courthouse steps. Christopher Tapp, now 20 years old, stood before Judge Harrison to learn his fate. The courtroom was again packed, with Carol Dodge occupying her familiar spot in the front row. "Mr. Tapp," Judge Harrison began, his voice stern and measured, "you have been found guilty of the most serious crimes our legal system recognizes. The brutal rape and murder of Angie Dodge has scarred this community permanently." Tapp's court-appointed attorney had filed motions requesting leniency based on his client's age and lack of criminal history. But the brutality of the crime and the community's demand for justice weighed heavily in the courtroom. "The court sentences you to 30 years to life for murder in the first degree," the judge continued. 25 years for rape, 10 years for use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. These sentences will run consecutively. The mathematics were simple and devastating. Christopher Tapp would spend the rest of his young adulthood and middle age behind bars. If he lived long enough, he might see freedom as an old man. Tapp's mother wailed from the gallery. His few supporters sat in stunned silence. For most observers, however, the sentence felt appropriate for such a heinous crime. Carol Dodge felt hollow rather than vindicated. She had waited nearly 2 years for this moment, expecting it would bring closure. Instead, she felt only emptiness. Angie was still gone. The questions about DNA evidence still nagged at her consciousness. As court officers led Tapp away for the final time, he turned back once more. His eyes found Carol's across the crowded courtroom. In that brief moment, she saw something that haunted her. Not the cold stare of a killer, but the broken gaze of someone who might be innocent. Outside, Idaho Falls began to move on. The years passed slowly in Idaho Falls. The Angie Dodge murder faded from daily conversation, relegated to the category of solved cases that people preferred not to revisit. Life returned to its familiar rhythms of seasonal changes, high school football games, and community festivals. But for Carol Dodge, time stopped on June 13, 1996. Every morning, she woke to the same devastating reality. Every evening, she stared at Angie's empty bedroom, preserving it exactly as her daughter had left it. The weekly visits to Angie's grave became Carol's ritual of grief and determination. She would kneel beside the simple granite marker, brushing away leaves and snow, updating her daughter on her ongoing fight for truth. "I met with the prosecutor again this week," she would whisper to the headstone. I asked about the DNA evidence. He says the case is closed, but I know you're listening. I know you want me to keep asking questions. Carol's kitchen table became a command center for her private investigation. Boxes of court transcripts, police reports, and newspaper clippings covered every surface. She corresponded with journalists, legal experts, and advocacy groups, anyone who might help her understand why the physical evidence didn't match the conviction. Her husband watched with growing concern as Carol's obsession consumed their home life. The jury made their decision, he would say gently. Maybe it's time to let Angie rest. But Carol couldn't rest. The DNA evidence that failed to match Christopher Tapp haunted her thoughts. In other cases across the country, she read about DNA exonerations, freeing innocent people. If science could prove innocence, why hadn't it proven Tapp's guilt? Winter snow fell on Angie's grave marker, covering the inscription but never dimming Carol's determination. She whispered the same promise each visit. I'm not done yet, sweetheart. I'm not done. Prison life was brutal for Christopher Tapp. As a convicted child killer, he faced constant threats from other inmates. Protective custody became his only safe haven, but it meant 23 hours daily in a cell barely larger than a closet. The Idaho Innocence Project received hundreds of letters from inmates claiming wrongful conviction. Most were dismissed quickly, but Tapp's case file caught the attention of attorney Sarah Johnson, who had spent years studying coerced confessions. Dear Idaho Innocence Project, Tapp had written in careful handwriting, "My name is Christopher Tapp, and I was wrongfully convicted of murder. I know you probably hear this from everyone, but I'm innocent. They made me say things that weren't true. Please help me." Johnson requested the complete case file, including interrogation recordings that the public had never heard. What she discovered shocked her professional sensibilities. Hours of psychological pressure applied to a vulnerable teenager, threats of execution, suggestions of leniency in exchange for admissions. The techniques used on Tapp violated every guideline for proper interrogation. Johnson had seen coerced confessions before, but rarely with such obvious manipulation documented on tape. She began visiting Tapp in prison, building trust slowly. Years of incarceration had changed him from the nervous teenager who had first entered the interrogation room. He was harder now, more cautious, but his eyes still held the same desperate honesty. They kept saying, "I would get the death penalty if I didn't cooperate," he told Johnson during one visit. "I was 19 and terrified. I would have said anything to make it stop." Johnson studied the interrogation transcripts with growing outrage. The confession contained details that didn't match the physical evidence, inconsistencies that should have raised red flags. Most damning of all, not a single piece of scientific evidence supported Tapp's guilt. She opened his appeal letter with determination. The conviction of Christopher Tapp represents a profound miscarriage of justice. By 2010, the Idaho Innocence Project had assembled a team of lawyers, forensic experts, and investigators dedicated to overturning Christopher Tapp's conviction. Their legal brief challenged every aspect of the original case, from the coercive interrogation techniques to the absence of physical evidence. Sarah Johnson presented their findings to Carol Dodge during a tense meeting at a downtown coffee shop. Carol had initially resisted meeting with Tapp's advocates, fearing they would minimize Angie's suffering. "Mrs. Dodge," Johnson began carefully, "we understand your pain and your need for justice, but we believe the wrong person is in prison for your daughter's murder." The lawyer spread crime scene photographs and DNA reports across the small table. She explained how modern forensic analysis had advanced far beyond 1996 capabilities. The evidence that had been dismissed or ignored could now be examined with precision. "The DNA found on Angie doesn't match Christopher Tapp," Johnson emphasized. "It doesn't match anyone in the criminal databases. That means the real killer is still free." Carol studied the documents with growing alarm. The scientific evidence was overwhelming and troubling. If Tapp was innocent, then Angie's killer had escaped justice for over a decade. "But he confessed," Carol said, her voice uncertain. "I heard the recordings myself." Johnson played excerpts from the interrogation tapes, pointing out the leading questions and psychological pressure. False confessions happen more often than people realize, especially when vulnerable suspects are subjected to coercive techniques. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, Carol's worldview had shifted dramatically. The young man she had watched being sentenced might be as much a victim as her daughter. "What can we do?" Carol asked finally. "Help us prove his innocence," Johnson replied. "Help us find Angie's real killer." Media attention returned to the Angie Dodge case as news of the Innocence Project's investigation spread. Local television stations revisited the original coverage, this time questioning whether justice had been served. Carol Dodge agreed to her first television interview in over a decade. Sitting in her living room, surrounded by photos of Angie, she spoke with quiet determination about her changed perspective. "For years, I believed Christopher Tapp killed my daughter," she told the interviewer. "The confession seemed so clear, but now I've seen the evidence that was ignored. I've learned how false confessions happen. I believe we convicted an innocent man." The interview sent shockwaves through Idaho Falls. Residents who had assumed the case was settled suddenly faced uncomfortable questions. If Tapp was innocent, then a killer had walked free among them for 15 years. Prosecutor Henderson, now retired, defended the original conviction in his own television appearance. "We had a confession," he insisted. Multiple statements from the defendant placing himself at the scene. The jury heard all the evidence and made their decision. But legal experts interviewed for the news stories pointed out the problematic aspects of the case: the reliance on coerced confession, the dismissal of exculpatory DNA evidence, the absence of any physical proof connecting Tapp to the crime. Public opinion began to shift. Online forums buzzed with debates about the case. Some residents demanded Tapp's immediate release. Others insisted the conviction was sound and criticized what they saw as Monday morning quarterbacking. Carol's public support for Tapp's innocence carried enormous weight. As Angie's mother, her voice commanded respect from even the most skeptical observers. If she believed the wrong man was in prison, perhaps it was time to listen. The groundswell of doubt was growing impossible to ignore. The legal breakthrough came in 2017 when the Idaho Court of Appeals agreed to hear Christopher Tapp's case. Advances in DNA technology had made it possible to conduct more sophisticated testing on evidence from Angie's apartment. The courtroom was packed for the hearing. Carol Dodge sat alongside Tapp's family and legal team, a symbolic unity that would have been unimaginable years earlier. Reporters filled the back rows, sensing a historic decision approaching. Sarah Johnson presented her arguments with meticulous precision. She detailed the coercive interrogation techniques used on Tapp. She explained how the DNA evidence had been mishandled or ignored. Most importantly, she demonstrated how modern science could definitively exclude Tapp as the source of biological evidence found at the crime scene. "Your Honors," Johnson concluded, "Christopher Tapp has spent 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. The DNA evidence proves his innocence. The confession was coerced through psychological manipulation. Justice demands his immediate release." The prosecution's response was notably subdued. New DNA testing had indeed excluded Tapp as the source of genetic material found on Angie. Without the confession, which was now understood to be coerced, they had no case against him. Judge Matthews delivered the ruling with obvious gravity. After careful consideration of all evidence, this court finds that Mr. Tapp's conviction for rape cannot stand. The DNA evidence conclusively excludes him as the perpetrator. The courtroom erupted as Tapp's supporters cheered. His mother wept with relief. Carol Dodge smiled through her own tears, knowing they were one step closer to finding Angie's real killer. But the murder conviction remained intact. Tapp walked out of the courthouse a partially free man, still branded as a killer by the law. Christopher Tapp emerged from prison into a world that had changed dramatically during his incarceration. Cell phones were everywhere. The internet had transformed daily life. Social media connected people across vast distances. At 39 years old, he felt like a time traveler arriving from the past. Carol Dodge met him at the prison gates, an encounter that stunned observers. The mother of the victim, embracing the man once convicted of killing her daughter, represented a powerful symbol of reconciliation and shared purpose. "I'm sorry it took so long," Carol whispered as they hugged. Tap's voice was hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for believing in my innocence. Angie would be proud of you." But freedom brought its own challenges. Tap's murder conviction still stood, making him unemployable to most employers. Housing was difficult to secure. Former friends had moved on with their lives. The world had continued turning, while his had remained frozen. Carol became his unlikely advocate, using her moral authority to support his complete exoneration. She appeared at press conferences and community meetings, explaining why she believed in his innocence. Meanwhile, investigators had quietly begun pursuing new leads. The DNA evidence that had excluded Tap still existed, waiting to be matched with its true owner. Advances in genetic genealogy offered promising new investigative techniques. Detective work resumed in earnest. Cold case investigators uploaded the unknown DNA profile to public ancestry databases, hoping to identify distant relatives who might lead to the killer. Carol visited Angie's grave with renewed hope. "We're getting closer, sweetheart," she whispered to the headstone. "The real person who hurt you is going to face justice." The investigation that had stalled for 20 years was finally moving forward. In 2018, genetic genealogy emerged as a revolutionary tool for solving cold cases. The technique used public ancestry databases to identify distant relatives of unknown DNA profiles, then worked backward through family trees to find potential suspects. Carol Dodge personally appealed to the Idaho Falls Police Department to use this new technology. She met with the chief of police, bringing boxes of evidence and years of documentation about the case's flaws. "My daughter's killer has been free for 22 years, she told the chief. "We have his DNA. We have this new technology. Please use every tool available to find him." The police department agreed to partner with genetic genealogy experts. The DNA profile from Angie's crime scene was uploaded to GED Match, a database where people voluntarily shared genetic information to research family history. Detective Lisa Morrison took charge of the renewed investigation. She had joined the force years after Angie's murder, but felt personally invested in solving the case. The community's pain over the wrongful conviction demanded justice. The genealogy search began slowly. Genetic matches appeared in the database, distant cousins and great-nieces of the unknown killer. Professional genealogists constructed family trees, working forward through generations to identify potential suspects. Carol checked in with Morrison weekly. Each phone call brought hope and anxiety in equal measure. Would this new technology finally reveal the truth, or would they hit another dead end? The breakthrough came in early 2019. A strong genetic match appeared. Someone closely related to the killer had uploaded their DNA profile to the database. Morrison's hands trembled as she examined the family tree. The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn. The genetic genealogy results pointed investigators toward a family tree with multiple branches in the Idaho Falls area. Professional genealogists worked methodically through each possibility, eliminating suspects based on age, location, and other factors. Detective Morrison studied mugshots and driver's license photos of potential matches. One face stopped her cold. Brian Lee Drips, Sr., born in 1963, had lived in Idaho Falls during the time of Angie's murder. More importantly, property records showed he had lived across the street from Angie's apartment building. The revelation was stunning. For over 20 years, investigators had sought a killer in Angie's social circle. They had interrogated her friends and acquaintances, but the real perpetrator had been a stranger living just yards from her front door. Surveillance began immediately. Drips, now in his 50s, worked construction jobs around the valley. He lived alone in a modest rental house, keeping to himself and avoiding social interactions. Morrison's team followed him for weeks, documenting his routines and waiting for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample. They needed definitive proof before making an arrest that would shock the community. The chance came at a local gas station. Drips bought coffee and cigarettes, discarding the cup and cigarette pack in a trash bin outside. Within minutes, evidence technicians secured both items. The lab results took 3 agonizing weeks. Morrison called Carol Dodge as soon as the report arrived. Mrs. Dodge, we have a match. The DNA from your daughter's case matches Brian Dripp's. We're making the arrest tomorrow. Carol sat down heavily, overwhelmed by emotions she had carried for 23 years. Relief, vindication, and overwhelming sadness crashed over her simultaneously. Is Christopher finally free? She whispered. He will be soon, Morrison replied. Brian Lee Dripp Sr. was arrested on May 15, 2019, at his construction job site. Surrounded by co-workers who barely knew him, he offered no resistance as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The interrogation that followed was nothing like Christopher Tapp's ordeal 23 years earlier. Dripps was read his rights immediately. He had access to an attorney. The questioning was professional and recorded properly. We have your DNA from the Angie Dodge crime scene, Detective Morrison explained calmly. We know you were there. We know what you did. Dripps sat silently for several minutes, his weathered hands folded on the metal table. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. I was drinking that night, he said. I saw her through the window. I knocked on the door. She let me in. The confession came in short, cold sentences. No dramatic breakdown, no tears or remorse, just the mechanical recounting of a brutal crime by someone who had hidden it for decades. Did anyone else help you? Morrison asked. No, it was just me. I acted alone. The simplicity of his admission contrasted sharply with Tapp's coerced and contradictory statements. This was how a real confession sounded. Direct, consistent, and supported by physical evidence. Within hours, prosecutors moved to dismiss all charges against Christopher Tapp. After 21 years in prison, he was finally and completely exonerated. Carol Dodge received the call she had dreamed of for over 2 decades. It's over, Morrison told her. We got him. Christopher is free. Angie's killer is in custody. That night, for the first time since 1996, Carol slept peacefully. Justice had finally found its way to Idaho Falls. The courtroom was packed for Brian Dripp's first appearance. Unlike the circus atmosphere that had surrounded Christopher Tapp's trial, this proceeding was somber and straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendant had confessed. Carol Dodge sat in the same front row seat she had occupied decades earlier, but this time she felt genuine closure approaching. The man who had stolen her daughter's life sat shackled at the defendant's table, his eyes avoiding her gaze. Prosecutor Williams outlined the charges: murder in the first degree, rape, and burglary. The DNA evidence was conclusive. Dripps's own confession provided additional confirmation. Your Honor, the state has overwhelming evidence linking the defendant to this heinous crime, Williams stated. After 23 years, justice will finally be served. Dripp's court-appointed attorney advised him to cooperate fully. There was no viable defense. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The confession had been given voluntarily. Mr. Dripps, Judge Foster asked, do you understand the charges against you? Yes, Your Honor, he replied quietly. How do you wish to plead? The courtroom held its collective breath. Even though everyone expected his answer, hearing it would provide official closure to one of Idaho Falls' most notorious cases. Guilty, Your Honor, guilty to all charges. Gasps and tears filled the gallery. Carol Dodge closed her eyes and felt 23 years of weight lift from her shoulders. Angie's killer had finally been held accountable. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, allowing time for victim impact statements and pre-sentence investigations. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Carol for her reaction. Today, justice was served, she said simply. Not just for Angie, but for Christopher Tapp as well. Sentencing day arrived with spring sunshine, warming the courthouse steps. Carol Dodge had spent weeks preparing her victim impact statement, the words she had waited over 2 decades to speak directly to her daughter's killer. The courtroom was again filled to capacity. Christopher Tapp sat in the gallery, finally able to witness justice being served in the case that had destroyed half his life. Local and national media covered the historic conclusion. Judge Foster called the court to order with unusual gravity. This case represents both the worst of human nature and the best of our justice system's ability to eventually correct its mistakes, he began. Carol approached the podium with measured steps. She carried a photo of Angie, placing it where Drips could see his victim's face clearly. "Brian Drips," she began, her voice steady and strong. "You stole my daughter's life on June 13, 1996. Angie was 18 years old, with unlimited potential. She was kind, creative, and loved by everyone who knew her." Her words filled the silent courtroom. "For 23 years, I have carried the pain of not knowing who hurt her. For 21 of those years, an innocent man suffered in prison for your crime. Your cowardice destroyed multiple lives." Drips stared at the table throughout her statement, never acknowledging her words or showing emotion. "The sentence you receive today will never equal the life sentence you gave my family," Carol continued. "But knowing you will spend your remaining years behind bars gives me peace." Judge Foster then addressed Drips directly. "You have committed one of the most heinous crimes this community has ever seen. The court sentences you to 20 years to life in prison." The gavel's echo marked the end of a tragic chapter. News of Drips' sentencing dominated headlines across Idaho and beyond. The story of wrongful conviction, DNA exoneration, and genetic genealogy breakthrough captured national attention. "Idaho cold case solved after 25 years," screamed the front page of the Idaho Falls Post-Register. Television news programs featured the case as an example of both injustice and ultimate vindication. Christopher Tapp gave his first extensive interview since his complete exoneration. "I lost 21 years of my life," he told reporters, "but I'm grateful that the truth finally came out. I'm grateful to Carol Dodge for believing in my innocence." The broader implications of the case sparked community discussions about criminal justice reform. How had an innocent teenager been convicted on coerced confession alone? What other cases might involve similar injustices? Carol Dodge became an unlikely advocate for interrogation reform and DNA testing improvements. She spoke at community forums and legal conferences, sharing her experience of initially believing in a wrongful conviction. Idaho Falls grappled with uncomfortable truths about their justice system. The police department implemented new interrogation protocols. Prosecutors promised to never again pursue charges without physical evidence. The community also celebrated the resolution. Vigils were held honoring Angie's memory and Christopher's ordeal. Candles flickered in Riverside Park as hundreds gathered to mark the end of their shared trauma. Local churches organized memorial services. The high school where Angie had graduated established a scholarship in her name. Her legacy transformed from tragedy to inspiration, but scars remained. Trust in local institutions had been damaged. Families questioned how many other innocent people might be imprisoned. The case became a cautionary tale about the fragility of justice. Christopher Tapp faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding a life that had been stolen from him at age 20. Now 41, he possessed few job skills and no recent work experience. The world had changed dramatically during his incarceration. Employment applications asked about criminal convictions, even though his had been vacated. Background checks revealed his decades in prison. Despite his legal innocence, many employers remained reluctant to hire him. Carol Dodge used her community connections to help Tapp find opportunities. She vouched for his character and advocated for his employment with local businesses. Her moral authority carried weight in Idaho Falls. Eventually, Tapp found work with a construction company whose owner believed in second chances. The physical labor was demanding, but he approached each day with gratitude for his freedom. Simple pleasures overwhelmed him. Choosing what to eat for breakfast, walking outside without guards, talking to people without time limits. The basic freedoms most people took for granted felt miraculous. Tapp began speaking to law students and police academies about false confessions. His first-hand experience provided powerful lessons about interrogation techniques and their potential for misuse. "I was young and scared," he would tell audiences. "I thought cooperating would help me go home. I had no idea that my words would be twisted into a confession." Legal experts cited his case when advocating for recording all interrogations and providing attorneys during questioning. His suffering had become a catalyst for systemic reform. Meanwhile, Carol continued, her weekly visits to Angie's grave. He's doing well, she would tell the headstone. Christopher is building a new life. Your case changed everything, sweetheart. It made the system better. 2 years after Drip's conviction, Carol Dodge stood at a podium before the Idaho Criminal Justice Reform Conference. The audience included prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and law enforcement officials from across the state. Her transformation from grieving mother to justice advocate had been gradual but profound. The case that had once destroyed her faith in the system had ultimately strengthened her commitment to improving it. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, looking out at the packed auditorium, I stand before you as someone who experienced both the failures and the eventual triumph of our justice system. She spoke about the importance of physical evidence in criminal cases, the dangers of coercive interrogation techniques, the need for thorough investigation before filing charges. For 21 years, I believed we had justice for my daughter, she explained. I was wrong. An innocent man suffered while the real killer remained free. We cannot allow this to happen again. The audience listened with rapt attention as she described her journey from acceptance to doubt to advocacy. Her presentation included recordings from Tapp's interrogation and DNA evidence that had been ignored. Christopher Tapp lost half his life to a system that failed him, she continued. My daughter's killer walked free for 23 years because we stopped investigating too soon. Reform isn't just about helping criminals. It's about protecting innocent people. The conference approved several recommendations inspired by Angie's case. Mandatory recording of all interrogations, improved DNA testing protocols, better training for investigators and prosecutors. As applause filled the auditorium, Carol felt Angie's presence with her. Her daughter's death had become a catalyst for preventing future tragedies. The fight for justice had evolved into a fight for systemic change. On a crisp autumn day in 2022, Carol Dodge walked alone along the Snake River path where Angie had once jogged. Golden leaves drifted down from cottonwood trees, carpeting the ground in seasonal beauty. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, Angie's favorites, picked from their old garden. The ritual had become her way of processing the long journey from tragedy to resolution to advocacy. 26 years had passed since that horrible June morning. Carol was older now, her hair silver and her steps slower, but her spirit carried a strength forged in the fires of loss and struggle. The memorial stone placed along the river path bore a simple inscription, Angie Ray Dodge. Her light continues to shine. Visitors often left flowers or small tokens, testament to how her story had touched the broader community. Carol knelt beside the stone, arranging the wildflowers carefully. We did it, sweetheart, she whispered to the engraved words. Justice was served. Christopher is free. The system is changing. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around her, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of seasons to come. The river flowed steadily past, constant in its motion, like the passage of time itself. I miss you every day, Carol continued, her voice soft but strong. But I'm proud of what your case accomplished. Other families won't have to suffer what we did. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Angie had always loved sunsets. Walking back toward town, Carol carried with her the peace that comes from a promise kept, a fight finished, and justice finally served.